Hey YouTube, Qliphort here, bringing you all an update to my Qliphort Yugioh deck profile. This is an update for post the September 2024 ban list because I did have to mix around some numbers because this deck heavily used skill drain, and we were also testing out Pot of Prosperity with the latest build of the deck. So those numbers had to be changed after the latest ban list that we've had. But this is one of my favorite Pendulum decks. It's just a very straightforward Pendulum deck with its playstyle, summoning out your big monsters to then be able to tribute summon out your even bigger Qliphort monsters, and then gain additional card effects based on the tribute. I've mixed around a couple cards with the deck and also added some other cards that I've definitely enjoyed playing with it, just for its overall playstyle. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. So we'll go ahead and start off with the main deck monsters. For our Qliphort monsters, I'm running 3 copies of Qliphort Scout. It is a normal Pendulum monster with only its card effect being its Pendulum Scale effect. You cannot special summon monsters except for Qli monsters. This effect cannot be negated, and once per turn, you can pay 800 life points to add 1 Qli card from your deck to your hand, except for Qliphort Scout. So when it says Qli card, it means the majority of cards. You can run and add either of your Qliphort monsters that you run. You can run and add cards like Sacrifice to your hand. You can add your trap cards, all as long as they have the QLI in their name, they can be added off of Qliphort Scout. So an immense, searcher in the deck. It is also not a, hard once per turn. So with this card, if it's bounced back to your hand or you activate another copy of it, you can in turn activate and use that 800 life point pay for this card also. For the other normal monster, we run 2 copies of Qliphort Monolith. You cannot special summon monsters except for Qli monsters. This effect cannot be negated during the end phase if you tribute summon in this card. If you tribute summon this turn, you can draw a number of cards equal to the number of Qli monsters you tributed for those tribute summons. So if you had 3 Qliphort monsters on the field that you tributed, that's 3 draws off of Monolith. It's perfectly the best other scale to run with Scout, having the needed scales for the good majority of your Pendulum summons for your Qliphort monsters, and then that additional draw and search, just, you'll sift through so many cards in the deck thanks to this card alone. For the monsters you want to Pendulum summon out, we're running 3 copies of Qliphort Carrier. With this card, it has an attack boost Pendulum Scale effect, giving all Qli monsters you control 300 attack, and also the restriction, which all the Qliphort cards have for not being able to special summon monsters except for Qli monsters. But the big play here is you can also normal summon out your effect monster, Qliphort monsters. They become a level 4 monster with 1800 attack. That's the one thing you have to remember with these cards. But with Qliphort Carrier, when it's tributed for a Qli tribute summon, you can target a monster on the field, and with this card, bounce it back to the hand. So with this card, it's very useful for that bounce power effect as well, meaning you can bounce your opponent's cards and make it in turn part of the chain link if you have another effect active with your other Qliphort monsters. And we also run 3 copies of Qliphort Helix, the same card effect as Carrier with this card, also making it so instead of your monsters getting attack, your opponent's monsters lose 300 attack. But this one also destroys a spell or trap on the field by targeting when it's tributed. So you have a monster bouncing effect with Carrier and a spell and trap destruction effect with Helix. For the lower numbers for the Qliphort monsters, but also the ones we tribute summon for the bigger plays, 2 copies of Qliphort Stealth. With this card, basically when it's tribute summon, you could target a card on the field and bounce it back to the hand, and your opponent can activate card or effects in response to this effect's activation. So if Stealth is the last thing to happen in the chain link, your opponent can't react to the entire chain link. So basically, if you have any of your other Qliphort tributes, you'll be able to resolve these without fail for your opponent, making Stealth very, very useful. And even if you don't have a card for your opponent to bounce, you can always bounce your own Scout that you have in the Pendulum Scale and then reactivate it again, giving you another search. We're also running 2 copies of Qliphort Shell, with this one having a piercing battle damage effect and being able to make a second attack during each battle phase when it's tributed. So very, very useful for that same play. Having 2800 attack, you can hit for some pretty big damage, and even if you swing into a defense monster, still swing for some big damage also. With the last of our Qliphort monsters, first we'll go over the one-ofs for the 2 Pendulums, 1 Cephalopod and 1 Qliphort Disc. With this card being discs set up for monsters, being able to summon out 2 Qliphort monsters to the field when you summon disc. Now the big play here will come later on with some of the other spells I'm running, and Cephalopod being able to, with this card, if your opponent has more monsters in the graveyard than you do, gain life points equal to the difference times 300, and if you do, inflict the same amount of damage to your opponent. Now this is what I like because there are some scenarios, especially when time comes up, Cephalopod could come in handy just for that life point gain. So you want to at least run that one to be able to do that and have one additional high scale Pendulum Qliphort monster to go into also. And then our big boss monster for the deck is Qliphort Towers. It cannot be special summoned, requires 3 Qli tributes to normal summon or set. If this card is normal summon or set, it's unaffected by spell or trap effects and the activated effects of any of your opponent's monsters whose level or rank is lower than this card's level. All special summon monsters lose 500 attack and defense, and once per turn, you can make your opponent send 1 monster from their hand or their side of the field of the graveyard, their choice. So while it's not so protective against link monsters, I've gone back and forth between the 2 different Qliphort monsters, and I've decided to stick with Towers. It's still my favorite and very, very useful to use for just that overall lockdown. If you know you're going up against a link heavy deck, you don't have to necessarily run it, but still it's an added option because when you tribute summon this card out, if you have your Monolith on the field, you will be getting a draw 3 also thanks to this card. For the spells, we're running 3 copies of Sacrifice, an equip spell with 4 different card effects. You equip it to a Qli monster, it gains 300 attack, it cannot be destroyed by battle. The equipped monster can be treated as 2 tributes for the tribute summon of a Qli monster, and if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add 1 Qli monster from your deck to your hand. Search, power, less of a tribute restriction, protection for your Qliphort monsters, and that additional attack boost. A very, very useful card. It's searchable off a scout, you name it. So even if you just have 1 pendulum summon for your Qliphort monster, if you equip Sacrifice onto it, then you have the 2 tribute monster needed for your bigger level Qli monsters. And I also run the 1 copy of Laser Clip. Once again, it can be searched off of Scout. It's an additional normal summon card to be able to just perform an additional normal summon in addition to your normal summon of the turn. So very, very useful going into that additional normal summon play. The 3 copies of Summoner's Art. Now this card's good in the deck because it can search out either your Monolith or your Scout. So you can just go from Summoner Art to Scout to 1 additional card you search off of the Scout also. And 3 copies of Pot of Extravagance. With the restriction of only being able to special summon Qli monsters while you have them in your Pendulum Scale, you really aren't using your extra deck for much. So a lot of it can be banished just off of the Pot of Extravagance to give you more draw in your hand. And other one-ofs include the 1 copy of Pot of Prosperity. Once again, put down to 1 in the latest ban list for the September 2024 lists. But still, with the specific banish, you could reveal cards off the top of your deck and also just go for that additional card that you may need for any of your plays. And lastly, for the spells, one I've really enjoyed using in the deck is Time Tearing Morganite. With this card for the rest of the duel, you apply this effect. You can activate monster effects from the hand. You draw 2 cards instead of 1 for your normal draw phase. You can conduct 2 normal summoner sets per turn, not just 1. And you can banish this card in your graveyard and discard 1 Time Tearing Morganite. Your opponent can activate monster effects when you normal summon this turn. So very, very useful for this deck since we aren't running any monster effects that activate in the hand. These are all a pendulum setup type of deck. So once you get those cards out, you go for your pendulum summon. It has no monster effects that activate in the hand for this deck. No hand traps or anything like that. So a perfect card just to give you that additional boost that this deck can provide. For the traps, for the Qli traps, I run 1 copy of Qliph's End and 1 copy of Climate Change. Climate Change adds back Qliphort monsters face up in your extra deck to your hand, and with your restriction for the extra deck, being able to have them back in your hand or rependulum summon out is a big help there. And Qliph's End, you special summon it as an effect monster, and also with this card during the turn it was summoned this way, Qli spell traps cannot be destroyed by card effects. If summoned this way, this card can be treated as 3 tributes for the tribute summon of an Qliphort monster. So you can use this 1 trap card to also just be able to summon out your Qliphort Towers. All the easier for that setup, but just the biggest weakness being obviously that it is a trap card. And then for the rest of the traps, I run the 1 copy of Rivalry of Warlords, the 1 Skill Drain, and the 1 Goes and Match. All restricted cards, definitely for depending on the deck that your opponent may play. We are also restricted to what we can set up in the spell and trap card zone, since we have to have Pendulum Scales also with this deck. So just having some continuous traps that we can use for more lockdown in the other spots always come in handy. With the other traps being 2 lose 1 turn. With this card, you activate only if you control currently no special summon monsters. While monsters face up on the field, negates effects during the turn it was special summon. If an effect monster is special summon in attack position, change it to defense. Once again, just a kind of budget restricted skill drain for you to use additionally in the deck. And lastly, the 1 copy of Soul Transition. Now with this card, if you control no special summon monsters, tribute a face up level 4 normal summon or set monster, draw 2 cards. So if you have your Qliphort monster, you can use this card then to tribute that Qliphort monster, and then also on top of, depending on the Qliphort monster you tributed, be able to use Soul Transition for 2 cards and also gain the effect of the tributed Qli monster. If you wanted to run a second copy of Soul Transition, you could try taking out the copy of Laser Clip since we are running the Time Tearing Morganite. I just like having these additional cards in case we don't see this card. We can, search out the Laser Clip with our Qliphort Scout. And then for the extra deck, I run 3 copies of our Qliphort Genius, the only extra deck monster that can be summoned properly while we have cards in our Pendulum Scales. Needing 2 machine monsters, this links summon cards unaffected by spell or trap effects and the activated effects of other link monsters once per turn. You can target one face-up card on each player's field. Except this card, both those cards have their effects negated till the end of this turn. And when 2 monsters special summon from the same time to zones this card points to, you can add 1 level 5 or higher machine monster from your deck to your hand. So this definitely does help. Whether you Pendulum summon those cards, you can even summon them off of Qliphort Disc to the zones that Genius points to, and then gain an additional bigger monster added from your deck to your hand for you to be able to summon out onto the field. A very, very useful play, especially with this deck, with the rest of our extra deck monsters being 1 Akashic Magician, 1 Beyond Pendulum, 1 Platinum Gadget, 1 Exceed Pendulum, 1 Blackluster Soldier of Chaos, 1 Decode Talker, 1 Nightmare Unicorn, 1 Access Code, and the 1 World Sea Dragon. Once again, we never go into these cards. They're just here mostly for the banish cost that we'll use for cards like Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Prosperity, with the only exceeds being 1 Daigusto Immorale, the 1 Exciton Knight, and the 1 Gear Gigan X. Once again, very situational. We almost rarely never go into these cards. And then as for some of the go-to plays in the deck, your best setup would be revolved around your initial hand that you play into. So with that and just this initial play, you could open up your Qliphort Scout, 1 additional Qliphort monster, and also let's go with the 2 of hand setup. So if we have these cards in our hand, we can then activate our Qliphort Scout using its card effect to then be able to complete our Pendulum Scale, adding our Monolith, summoning out the Monolith, and then from there we can Pendulum summon out the 1 of choice that we want. Using that for the tribute will give us our normal summoned out Qliphort monster. If you went second, you'll have the bounce effect for your opponent's card. If you wanted to do it vice versa, you could Pendulum summon out the Helix, tributing out the Carrier, and then destroy a spell or trap they have instead. And then at the end of the turn, you'll get 1 draw off of the Monolith as well. If you have the initial monsters in your hand, so let's say you have these monsters and also the addition of a Summoner's Art in your hand, you can use the Summoner's Art to instead add the Monolith, using the 800 from the Scout to be able to add cards like your Qliphort Stealth. Going for another Pendulum, you can Pendulum summon out these 2 monsters, then tribute both of them for the Qliphort Scout. Then the chain will resolve like this. You can activate the Helix as Chain Link 1, the Carrier as Chain Link 2, and then the Stealth as Chain Link 3. Your opponent will not be able to activate anything in response since the last thing that happened in the chain was Qliphort Stealth. So then you have the return of an opponent's monster, the destruction of one of their spell traps, and then you can use the Stealth to bounce the Scout back to your hand to then reactivate again and pay the 800 to get you another search from your deck to your hand also. Now the big play also comes down to if you have cards like this set up on your field. If you add instead your Qliphort Disc, you can go for the same tribute play with Disc, but then with this play, you will be summoning out 2 additional monsters from your deck to the field. It really doesn't matter what they are for their summon, because then you will use those 2 additional monsters that you summon to go into your Qliphort Genius play. Make sure you summon the normal summon in a way that keeps the 2 arrows open for Qliphort Genius, because then when you go into your following turn, or let's say you have that option, you can go for another Pendulum summon. This will give you your search for your additional level 5 or higher monster, since you summon 2 monsters to the arrows that the Qliphort monster points to also. So then you can add your Qliphort Towers from your deck to your hand. You can keep your bigger Qliphort monster on the field because you can use the 2 you Pendulum summon out and the Qliphort Genius to be able to summon out your bigger boss monster to the field also. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoyed. Once again, I'm very, very happy with the update changes I made to the Qliphort deck, and it's one of my favorite Pendulum decks, so always like to keep it up to date for those of you that are still fans of it as well. And as always, until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and Kira Twig out.